Dubai's always didn't just turn a blind eye, but two blind eyes from where that gold comes from. You know, these satellite images that we see of mountains of dead people within their own blood.
Yeah.
The capture of Al-Fasher put the RSF in a far more powerful position than they were before.
The RSF is being supported by the UAE. I mean, are there any good guys in this?
Starvation being used as well as a weapon. But one of the narratives that the UAE sort of influences is one where they're saying, you know, they're fighting the SAF as a proxy of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a little bit like the Israelis saying, oh, this guy's Hamas and this guy's Hamas. None of the European powers and the United States have actually come out openly pointing the finger at the UAE, despite the fact the evidence is there.
I think it's been called the forgotten war in many ways, because Ukraine and Gaza is happening.
Well, the atrocities that are being committed are very, not only sadistic, but it's very personal. It's a direct proximity between civilians and these fighters, where atrocities being committed against children and women in front of their entire family. Here's a country that has developed immense power and influence in the world. Why are they not using it for something good?
Dr. Andreas Krieg, welcome back to The Thinking Muslim. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me again.
Well, it's lovely to have you with us now. Today I want to talk about Sudan. I mean, it's a very precarious situation in Sudan, and we've been seeing some horrific scenes from Al-Fasher and from other places in Sudan. And it seems like this civil conflict, if we can call it that, or a conflict between two military men is just never ending. And the pressures that's putting on the ordinary Sudanese is heart-wrenching, really. So I think it's been called the forgotten war in many ways, because Ukraine and Gaza is happening, and for whatever reason, we just haven't spoken enough about Sudan. And today we want to correct that a little bit on this show. And I know you've been talking a lot about it, and you've been writing about the various factions, in particular the relationship between the UAE and one of those factions, the RSF, led by General Hemeti. And I want to talk about the UAE's role. But let's maybe step back a little bit. Let's start with the background. So this is in effect a conflict between two generals. You've got General Burhan from the SAF, and then you've got General Hemeti from the irregular RSF force. Just tell us a little bit about these two individuals, because they were former allies. Why did they fall out, and why has that led to this catastrophic conflict across Sudan?
An atrocious conflict, really, if you look at the pictures and images that came out of Al-Fasher. So how far do you want to go back is the question, but generally the media portrays this as a binary conflict between the RSF and the SAF.
Yeah.
It's a bit more complex than that, because both of these actors aren't, hierarchies which just rally around this one leader. I mean, they're kind of, hierarchical entities where you have all kinds of different sort of militias and non-state actors or paramilitary actors. And basically, these are two networks that are clashing, where militias and brigades are fighting within one sphere of influence, which is one is revolving around the Hemeti family, this warlord who runs the RSF. And the other one revolves around the SAF, which is the more regular military, but also in itself works with paramilitary groups, and is a remnant of the Omar Bashir time sort of regular military. These two have been clashing for the last 2.5 years, since April 2023, but we shouldn't forget that for a long time they were working together. And so they're part of the same problem, really, because if what the people in Sudan wanted in that revolution 2018-2019 was kind of creating wanted to get rid of one dictatorship, Bashir, and then replacing it with some sort of civilian rule, and that never really happened. What we ended up with is a pseudo-civilian rule for a year or two with a civilian sort of face. But in reality, we transitioned from this Omar Bashir Islamist military sort of dictatorship to a military dictatorship run by the SAF and the RSF, who really control all elements of power, and obviously have a monopoly over violence in the country for many years. And they staged then a coup in 2021 against the civilian face of this transitionary government, and very much established a military dictatorship. And so both of them were part of that. Both of them were cooperating. But over time, the SAF, which was obviously quote unquote the regular military, wanted the paramilitary RSF to integrate into their sort of chain of command. And Hemeti and the RSF said, no, definitely not. Also because Hemeti has grown into a far more powerful player than just being a warlord. He's also a major economic player, a billionaire, with extensive funds and access to resources in southern Sudan, which make him, extremely powerful. And so he refused to do that. And that refusal to integrate between 21 and 23 really led to the outbreak of the current civil war, where the RSF has been trying to usurp governance altogether, capturing Khartoum or trying to capture the government. They failed, or they were pushed out eventually by the SAF. But it's a stalemate. It's not really, neither side is winning. I mean, it's a bit like World War I in the European battlefield, where one year or one month you have the SAF making an offensive and kind of gaining territory in the other, and then the next month you'll have the RSF regaining that territory. And obviously, as of late, the capture of Al-Fasher certainly made the RSF, or put the RSF in a far more powerful position than they were before. But we're basically in this stalemate right now, where the RSF has, as of late, gained territory, but are nowhere near powerful enough to win this conflict and take over Khartoum. Neither is the SAF powerful enough to really recapture Darfur from the RSF. So we're in that stalemate now.
Assalamu alaikum. This is your brother Mazen Mukhtar, CEO at Baitulmaal. Every day, our team at Baitulmaal is reminded of the countless blessings we have, one of which is you, our incredible donors. Because of you, families who once faced empty plates have shared warm meals together. Children who walked miles for water have access to clean drinking water. Communities devastated by disaster have received emergency aid when they needed it most. And in the harshest winters, your generosity has wrapped thousands in warmth and dignity. These programs were only made possible because of your compassion, your trust, and your belief in our shared humanity. On behalf of our entire team and the communities we serve, thank you for supporting our work. And thank you for turning your compassion into hope every year with Baitulmaal.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
So this is a conflict between two generals who formerly had warm relations. They were allies, and they worked, of course, under the Omar al-Bashir dictatorship. They thwarted, did you say, the civilian rule in many ways, civilian government. The cries of the revolution were undone by these two military men. So I suppose, often we can characterize this conflict in a very binary way. The RSF is being supported by the UAE, who we'll talk about, and so they're the bad guys, and Burhan's the good guy. I mean, are there any good guys in this conflict?
I mean, maybe the SAF is the lesser of two evils, if you will, but it's, in both, it's pest against cholera, really.
Right.
If you're a Sudanese and you want civilian governance, then neither side will deliver this for you. But I think what kind of makes the RSF stand out is the atrocities that they've committed, and the fact that they're obviously based on the genocidal Janjaweed, who was been accused of genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s and 2003.
Yeah, so explain that to me. So General Hemeti used to lead these Janjaweed militias, and they've been accused by all sorts of agencies, international bodies, credible people within Sudan of committing horrendous atrocities in Darfur.
Yes.
Largely against Sudanese Christians. Just explain that dynamic. Like, why is it that Omar Bashir, the former dictator, why did he need these irregular forces when he had the SAF, when he had the regular army?
So Sudan is if you look at the border of Sudan, again, it's one of these cases where the British and the colonial powers drew the map and drew the borders. And so you have a very diverse group of people living within the borders of Sudan, some of them being Christian, some of them being Muslim, some of them being different tribes who are transnational in nature, some of them living on the Sudanese side, others living on the Chadian side. You have an issue between what they call the Arab Sudanese and the Black African Sudanese. Usually that kind of correlates with the distinction between Christians and Muslims as well. But it was very much a racist ethnic conflict in the early 2000s. And Omar Bashir saw the rebels who were asking for more power or for more influence or for more autonomy in Darfur in the early 2000s. He saw them as an enemy of the regime. And he needed someone to clamp down, not in he didn't want to enter into negotiations. The intent was to exterminate the rebellion, and under the context of fighting that rebellion and counterinsurgency, they committed all kinds of atrocities against the people on the ground. And the RSF, obviously at the time didn't exist, but they used these Sudanese Muslim fighters, the Janjaweed, which means fighters on horseback, to kind of clamp down on this rebellion and kind of also kind of, acts of retribution against the civilian population as well, where, you see all kinds of massacres being committed. And it's one of the few occasions where you see a Western leader actually coming out and calling atrocities for what they are, genocide. And actually it was the US Secretary of State, Powell, who called it a genocide. So, under the Bush administration, again, most people didn't really recognize what was happening there because Iraq was going in Afghanistan and it was very much forgotten. But the Janjaweed were, they are accused, and there's a lot of evidence for war crimes being committed and for a genocidal campaign of extermination against these kind of mostly Christian, black, African Sudanese. And so the Janjaweed militia became sort of a deniable part of repression by the Bashir regime.
Right, because they were not regular forces.
They were not regular forces.
Right.
So plausible deniability, Bashir said, I have no idea what's going on there, although quite clear that they were quite powerful. And Hemeti is a very powerful warlord in the Janjaweed at the time, but he's not the only one. Over time, there are others. But he is really becoming over time an ever more powerful, omnipotent leader within the Janjaweed that then becomes a paramilitary force. After what they did in Darfur for the regime, they're being rewarded by becoming an unofficial paramilitary force within the Bashir regime.
Right. So the brutality of Hemeti's forces, the Janjaweed militia that's carried into this RSF force that has been created, that brutality remains. I mean, we saw some horrific scenes from Al-Fasher. Just explain what happened in Al-Fasher, and I suppose you talked a little bit about the strategic importance of this city. Like, why is this seen to be a major gain for the RSF forces?
No, Al-Fasher has been very much an embattled city for a while. It has been besieged for many, many months. Starvation being used as well as a weapon. But the SAF was able to hold it out because it's if you look at the map of Sudan, you can see it's at a very strategic sort of choke point between Darfur and the southern sort of corridor in the south of Sudan, where most of the resources are, especially where a lot of the oil is. Right. So if you want to control Darfur in particular, and that's ultimately what the RSF wants to achieve in the first instance, to make Darfur, to dig in Darfur and make sure that the SAF can't regain any of that territory in Darfur. And if you want to control Darfur, Al-Fasher is kind of one of these key sort of choke points that you need to hold, and that you need to kind of defend as well if you wanted to keep Darfur, and if you wanted to then leap forward into the resource-rich basin to the east and potentially even go up north towards Khartoum, you need to take Al-Fasher. So it's a very pivotal moment, if you will, in reconquering all of Darfur and potentially preparing a bigger offensive further east and further north.
Right, okay. And we noticed that a lot of the RSF fighters, they tend to film themselves committing these atrocities. So there is an impunity there. Like, why is there an impunity there? Why is it that they don't see a problem from a sort of like soft power, let's say, perspective, a problem with their actions and how they're conducting and prosecuting this conflict?
Well, the atrocities that are being committed are very, not only sadistic, but they're very, it's different from a remote warfare conflict like we see in Gaza, where, someone presses the button and you drop a bomb. It's a very personal, it's a direct proximity between civilians and these fighters, where atrocities being committed against children and women in front of their, the entire family. These satellite images that we see of, mountains of dead people within their own blood. Absolutely atrocious. And it's very much, this sort of barbaric approach is being celebrated as some sort of form of masculinity, of a show of strength by these militias who are basically showing off and saying, look what we're doing, and we'll come for you as well. It's an act of, it's a bit of an element of deterrence in there, of saying you better stop or else this is what we're going to do. What we're going to do to you. And a deterrent element is part of that ethnic cleansing, and that kind of connects this current conflict to what happened in 2003, which there was a clear campaign to push Christians and Black Africans and certain tribes that don't align with Hemeti, push them out of Darfur to the south or somewhere else. In this case, now probably to the east, because that form of deterrence is part of ethnic cleansing, right? And it has to be propagated in that way to show that this is something that might happen to whoever stands in the way of the RSF.
Now, Andreas, you are someone who you've studied and researched the role of the UAE in multiple conflicts across the world, and just how the UAE conducts itself, through these shadowy organizations, these middle organizations that help fund and create and develop these paramilitary forces in Libya, in Somalia, and elsewhere. Let's focus in on the UAE and its relationship with this RSF force. And so until today, as far as I know it, the UAE will swear blind that it has no relationship or little relationship with the RSF. Just, how would one respond to those claims?
Yeah, the narrative is there is no relationship with the RSF. The UAE is saying that they want a civilian government. They're saying that they want an inclusive Sudan and so on and so forth. But this is part of the sort of generous-faced, two-faced approach that the Emiratis are driving in many of these conflicts, where the official governance sector, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense in Abu Dhabi, is kind of following more or less the playbook of most other countries in this part of the world, very much formal engagements, diplomatic engagements, trying to work with the UN. They've done that in Yemen, they've done it in Libya. But then under the table, what really is the deeper and much more strategically relevant sort of form of or way of statecraft that they're using is these private networks of entities, mostly corporate entities, who are aligned directly with the inner circle of power in Abu Dhabi. What I would describe as the Bani Fatima, these three brothers around Mohammed bin Zayed, who were the sons of Zayed's wife Fatima, and they in their networks that they have with these massive sovereign equity-funded hubs, these networks are extremely instrumental in building relationships with these non-state actors, sustaining them logistically, helping them to bring commodities from, let's say, Africa into Dubai and laundering that, in this case, mostly gold, and also translating that cash into a value chain that can be used to purchase, any sort of support that they need. So logistics important, trading companies are important, private military and security companies are important because we have a lot of mercenaries there as well who are supporting the RSF. Some of these mercenaries have come from were in the UAE before or employed by companies registered in the UAE, so that again not coincidental. And so the UAE have really been able to supercharge their regular means of statecraft with these kind of informal networks that provide this fairly small state in terms of, remember the UAE is a country of 1 million citizens, with an ability to kind of use the full spectrum of statecraft that is necessary to sustain a war effort, such as this one in Sudan, and the RSF being the key surrogate here. But how do you respond to the allegation of them saying, we have no relationship with the RSF? So it's plausibly deniable. So if you use these kind of networks, there is always a 1 or 2 degrees of dissociation between what's happening on the ground and Abu Dhabi, and the core of power in Abu Dhabi. The relationship exists and it's easily traceable, but it's still plausible deniable. When you have a plane load of arms being flown into Chad, for example, where half of the plane or a third of the plane is humanitarian aid. UAE remains a donor of humanitarian aid, a very important one in Sudan. So they fly humanitarian aid in, and 2/3 or even more than that of the plane are actually military equipment and military support for the RSF.
How do we know this?
Now, there's a lot of investigative journalists who've been on the ground, who've been very reputable. These are not kind of conspiracy theories. It's been very well documented in the New York Times, but also a lot of I work in the due diligence space as well, looking at these into geopolitical risks on the ground. And if you tap into these networks on the ground who work in some of these airports, for example, who work with some of the companies as well. There's images out there, there's pictures that were taken. This is not hearsay. There is solid evidence. We have the UN expert panel on Sudan who've also really unpacked these links as well and showing how these arms come into the country. So that's all very well documented. And so, when the UAE say, we have no relationship, it might be that, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has no relationship with the RSF, although that is also disputable. But it certainly is these informal networks that do. And I think we should also not forget that the UAE were instrumental in 2019, after the revolution, to reach out to both Burhan and Hemeti, and using both of them as their pawns in order to control together at the time with Saudi, to kind of build this military dictatorship that then fell apart in 2023 prior to this civil war. So this relationship with Hemeti goes back at least, and that's another important aspect I think we need to talk about here, it goes back to the early 2010s when Hemeti emerges as a very, very powerful actor within the Janjaweed, powerful within the RSF, but also becomes a very important sort of businessman. I mean, when he seizes these gold mines in Darfur, he becomes a major player in the gold trade. And where does he bring his gold? There is no other hub but Dubai. And Dubai is always closed, didn't just turn a blind eye, but two blind eyes of where it came from, where that gold comes from, and how you can translate that gold, launder it in Dubai. All that is also well documented. So people estimate that the Hemeti family now is worth billions of dollars. That money, most of it is in the UAE because UAE banks are quite open to hold anybody's money. And Hemeti is able to access this money and buy whatever he needs for the RSF. That's one aspect. And that's the economic side. On the military side, what is important as well is that Hemeti becomes a mercenary in 2015, where he's saying he's no longer just fighting in Darfur, but he offers the RSF services, the Janjaweed services, to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia to fight for them as a proxy or surrogate in Yemen. So a lot of the RSF fighters go and fight in Yemen, return after this with quite a lot of money, but also with arms and equipment back into Darfur. So that relationship between Hemeti and the UAE predates this conflict right now. It predates even the engagement in 2019 when the Emiratis become a major player in building this military dictatorship. It goes back to, like I said, 2015 war in Yemen, where they worked very closely with the Emiratis, but also the gold trade, which was really supercharged in 2017 after the Janjaweed had a little bit of an internal coup, and Hemeti really emerges as the most potent player within the Janjaweed and within the RSF, and seizes all of the gold mines in Darfur and uses the UAE as a jurisdiction to launder that. And we see his brother in particular setting up businesses that are now listed by the US Treasury and sanctioned in the UAE to kind of facilitate this sort of illicit trade.
So there's a few threads there that I want to pick on, but let's just talk about the motive. Like, why is it that the UAE remains this major player in Sudan and is funding the RSF? And you spoke a little bit about gold. And is that the interest? The interest is the mineral wealth?
It's one aspect of it. Yeah. I think if you look at the narrative campaigns, and the UAE are doing a terrible job at the moment in terms of, and it's, you can't, I always say from a PR perspective, you can't polish a turd. If you're trying to kind of whitewash the RSF, it's impossible after the atrocities that were propagated. But one of the narratives that the UAE sort of influencers and bots are pushing at the moment is one where they're on the one hand they're saying they're fighting the SAF as a proxy of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's kind of this the go-to phrase that the UAE are using all the time. It's a little bit like the Israelis saying this guy's Hamas and this guy's Hamas. So what the Emiratis and their networks do is they say, this guy's Muslim Brotherhood, this guy, people who are not even Muslim. But the narrative in the UAE in Sudan now is that the SAF is a Muslim Brotherhood aligned entity. What is true, though, that there are some networks, Islamist networks from the Bashir time, that are still within the SAF sort of sphere of influence, if you will, and they support them. But to say that Burhan is a Muslim brother or that the SAF is a Muslim Brotherhood entity is just factually false. But there is this narrative, this value-based element of saying we're here because we're fighting the Islamists.
Right.
So I think it's a pretext, but it's one that's still, considering how obsessed the UAE are with the Muslim Brotherhood, with this notion. It's a paranoia that is no longer rationally explainable. And it has been let ad absurdum because it completely ridicules any sort of statement that the Emiratis make. It's still one aspect that we shouldn't completely disregard. But I would say the most important thing in Sudan for them is really is geostrategic, geopolitical, and geoeconomic in nature. So it's about Sudan being this sort of hub in a regional system, a strategic choke point to enter into the Horn of Africa. Number one is it has access to the Red Sea. The port of Sudan, Port Sudan is a very important port, and the Emiratis even have an MOU to build another port next to it. And so that was all part. That all came or became a part of their policy in this interim period from after the revolution to between the revolution and when the SAF and the RSF consolidated. The Emiratis wanted access to these logistical corridors that link up Sudan with Libya. Again, we have to remember much of the Arab Spring for the Emiratis and their counter-revolution starts in Libya. And Libya is the first sort of bridgehead that they build to get access into Africa. And so that corridor is important. It leads directly into Sudan. Sudan connects into Chad, again, where the Emiratis have quite a lot of interest. But it also links into sub-Saharan Africa, into Uganda. Again, Emiratis have a lot of interest. It links into Ethiopia, where, again, the Emiratis have a lot of interest and have been supplying the Abiy government. And it is another stepping stone from Somalia as well, where there could be a logistical network between Somalia and Sudan. Then there are, oil is very important. The Chinese have a major pipeline that goes from the south of Sudan all the way to the Red Sea coast. And much of the Darfur area in oil wealth is controlled by the Chinese. So the Emiratis want to be this larger than life sort of gatekeeper, if you will, in Sudan, of saying if the Chinese want to do business there, they got to speak to us. Anybody who wants to go into southern Sudan or Darfur, they have to speak to us because we control the RSF. And that's the geopolitical element of it, where they're saying we have access to geostrategic real estate and resources, where anybody who wants to have access to this has to speak to us. And they're kind of trading this. And the ultimate end game of this is, despite the fact that the entire world is against the RSF, I don't think there's anyone who speaks out on behalf of the RSF apart from the UAE. There's no one who would dare to do that, right?
Some UAE influences, yes.
Well, apart from, maybe if you're paid for by the UAE or you're Emirati, maybe that's what you would do. But nobody really does. But nonetheless, most people have realized that you need to speak to the Emirates, even if you absolutely disagree fundamentally with what they're doing in Darfur, because they're indispensable now. They've made themselves indispensable in this very strategically critical area of the world. And that is also part of their interest. They want to be, they always say, you need to call a +971, which is their country code, if you want anything done in Libya, in Sudan, in Somalia, or in Yemen. And it's true. They are the biggest, they're not the only player, but they're the most important player.
In that answer, you started with the sort of the ideological component. And sometimes we don't speak enough about this. It seems to me that the UAE is responsible for thwarting any form of civilian rule, civilian government across the region, not just in Sudan. Like, what's going on there? Does it really believe that if there's genuine civilian rule, then there will be an Islamist dimension to that? Is that the consideration there?
Yeah, so the Islamist scarecrow or boogeyman is really a catch-all phrase to say civil society. They're afraid not of the Islamists, but of civil society. And obviously civil society in this part of the world is often mostly Muslim and times Islamist, if you will. And the Emiratis are scared of the Arab street in this respect. And so the fear was that in 2018, 2019, during the revolution, if you give people the vote, they might vote for parties who are on the Islamist spectrum, if you will. And they're uncontrollable. They usually respond to the people. They usually don't revolve around one point of contact. The Emiratis love to have one point of contact, someone they can call if they need to solve something, like the Haftars of the world. They want something in Libya, they call this guy, and he can make it happen.
Strong men.
Yeah, you need a strong man. And usually a strong man in uniform who thinks hierarchical is preferable to someone who's, a civilian sort of strong man. So they're looking for people in uniform who can fulfill that strongman rule.
I mean, again, you mentioned that the UAE has taken a bit of a hit because of its relationship with the RSF. And I think on social media and even on mainstream media, there's now very clearly a connection has been drawn between the UAE and the RSF, and the atrocities of the RSF, of course, is really undermining the cultural power, let's say, that Dubai and Abu Dhabi have developed over the last couple of decades. How much do you feel they take that into consideration? Because it just seems to me that they're doubling down on their deniability, but also on they feel that there's more to be gained, I suspect, from Hemeti than to cut those strings.
It's interesting, isn't it? So the UAE have a tendency, and I'm writing a book at the moment about strategic culture in this part of the world, and there is something about Abu Dhabi's strategic culture that needs to be understood, and it's mostly the strategic culture of Mohammed bin Zayed. He's a very transactional, very Machiavellian man, someone who comes from the military, someone who has a tendency to double down, not to back down.
Sometimes when I hear you, I feel that you're somewhat impressed by him. Is
I
that
am
fair to
impressed.
say?
I'm very much impressed. If you think of how they transformed this, conventionally speaking, small state into this larger than life, center or hub of this massive network that very much dictates the terms, at least in the Middle East and parts of Africa.
Yeah.
That is impressive. I don't think any other Arab state has achieved that. Obviously, financial wealth is important, but others have financial wealth. I think they found a way to translate their financial wealth into power. That's what strategy is all about. It's about generating influence. Yeah. But it's very Machiavellian. It's very, it's very transactional. No value. It's not value-based at all. It's all about interest. Yeah. And so, someone like Mohammed bin Zayed looks at Sudan as purely how can I extract interest for me and Abu Dhabi in it. And so the kind of decision he has to make is whether the interest he's gaining from supporting the RSF by having control of the 4 strategically relevant trade corridors, access to resources, is that worth the costs of reputational cost of these of a mobilized Sudanese diaspora as well. I think we shouldn't forget that in the UK in particular, there's a lot of Sudanese who live here who feel very passionate about what's going on there. They might not support the SAF, but they're certainly not supporting the RSF. That is something you cannot underestimate. It drives mainstream media narrative, although I do think more should be done and more needs to be done on this. Yeah. But this is something this is now a problem that they cannot ignore anymore. We've got the US talking about it, the Europeans talking about it, but so far none of the European powers and the United States have actually come out openly pointing the finger at the UAE, despite the fact the evidence is there, despite the fact they're saying we know who's doing this, but we still don't want to call them out. I think the UK was the only ones who called them out in 2024, I think last year, and that caused a massive row and quite a lot of conflict and friction between London and Abu Dhabi. But why don't they do it? Because ultimately the UAE is a very powerful player. It's a player that makes strategic investments in this country, is a country that holds some control over our logistics hubs through DP World, for example, when they invest here. So they are a very powerful player. And the UK now is a beggar state in many ways. I mean, we need investments right now, and beggars can't be choosers, and you don't want to antagonize a potential major investor in your country. It's realpolitik, if you will. The same is true for other European countries. The only country that can make a difference is Donald Trump, is the United States. Yeah. And they themselves, at the moment, are holding back because they hope that the UAE can provide them with a deal.
Right. Because what I've noticed is, I mean, there is now I think they call it a quad. There is a conversation taking place about Sudan. I think it broke down recently because the UAE were not happy with Egypt's position on Sudan in particular. Donald Trump has appointed an envoy to Sudan. So there is some movement, some diplomatic movement, whereas, in the Biden administration, I didn't see very much movement at all. So there is something taking place here. I mean, is that substantial? Do you think that it will ultimately bear some fruits? Or, I mean, why is the Trump administration at least seemingly doing some action here?
No, for Trump, it's all about another, he wants headlines for himself, positive headlines. His administration doesn't rely on the formal infrastructure of the US government, the State Department or Defense Department. They're trying to do things their own way through their own private networks, through contacts and intermediaries. And they have delegated most of the regional statecraft to the Gulf countries anyway. I mean, to Saudi, to Qatar, and in the case of Sudan, to the UAE, because the UAE have been lobbying him, saying, look, we can help you bring this to an end, and you'll be the one to shine because you take the credit. You have the 12th, 13th war that you can claim you have ended, which works well for him. And obviously the atrocities have been very well documented and nobody can ignore it. Trump can't ignore it. Trump has been very public about it during the visit of Mohammed bin Salman to Washington this week, where he said, I want this to stop. And the Saudis used quite a lot of pressure on the Trump administration, saying you need to make this stop, and you also need to hold the Emiratis to account. So Trump is under pressure to do something, but the UAE is saying, just wait a minute, we'll have to consolidate a little bit of power. We'll have to do a bit of background behind closed doors chatting, and then when we get everyone around the table, we will solve this for you.
The Saudi-UAE relationship, because ideologically they're on the same side here. You would imagine that the Saudis what you pointed out there about the UAE 14 civilian rule. The Saudis are very much on side there. Why is there a rupture there when it comes to Sudan?
No, the Saudis are far more risk averse than the Emiratis. I think the Saudis are also far less innovative in their statecraft. They're very old school in the way they do things. They would have been very happy with a military dictatorship where the RSF and the SAF worked together, because that's at that time in 2019 till 2023, the UAE and Saudi were quite aligned on this. But now it seems like, and this is very similar to Yemen, which is another point of friction in Saudi-Emirati relations, where it starts as a joint project, Saudi-UAE, and then the UAE start to backstep the Saudis and do their own thing at their own expense. I think the difference here is that the Saudis do generally want some sort of stability. Let's call it authoritarian stability, but they believe in stability.
Yes.
They don't want war for war's sake. The Emiratis are quite happy to break some eggs to make an omelette, which is not the Saudi approach. The Saudis are very risk averse in that respect. They need to grow, they need development domestically, they can't have another conflict. The Saudis are very averse to conflict right now. And thereby they're at least for the moment, Mohammed bin Salman had a learning curve as well, considering where he was after he called for the slaughter and the murder of Khashoggi, and all the domestic sort of clampdown. I'm not saying that has stopped entirely, but there's a bit of a learning curve at least in foreign and security policy, where he said, okay, Yemen, we didn't, we learned our lesson. We weren't able to win. Diplomacy is the only way forward. We're willing to sit with everyone, even with the Houthis, to come to some sort of solution, which is pragmatic. So there's a 180-degree turn in that respect, at least. That sort of pragmatism also means they're willing to speak to different non-state actors. And the Emiratis are not like this. Like I said, the Emiratis haven't backed down ever. I mean, whether it's in Libya, where they failed to seize the capital, whether it's in Yemen, where they didn't succeed in kind of capturing Sana'a, whether it's in Sudan, where they will not be able to capture Khartoum or the rest of Sudan. They're quite happy with these little enclaves that they carve out for themselves that nobody can seize and that they can defend. And they use this as a bargaining chip. That's not the Saudi way. That's not the Gulfi way. The Gulfis want, they want to maintain sovereignty, territorial integrity of these states. And so that's where the friction comes from, particularly when what the Emiratis are doing comes at the expense of the Saudi position. So in Sudan, it comes very much at the expense of a united Sudan and a stable Sudan. It comes in Yemen at the expense of Saudi interests, because the Saudis are the ones who are stuck in the conflict in the north against the Houthis, while the Emiratis are carving out their own little sphere of influence in the south without actually supporting the Saudis. And so what's interesting now in Sudan over the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of the influencers, Saudi discourse, becoming very, very openly critical of the UAE, which is also a first, directly attacking and calling the Emiratis out. Really? That shows you that is obviously government-sponsored or backed or authorized, if you will. Yeah. But it shows where the Saudis stand on this. They're absolutely upset.
I mean, you don't think that the UAE believe it, that they've overplayed their hand in Sudan? I mean, just the amount of anger that's been generated across the world. I mean, potentially that may have a negative effect on, inward investment possibly, or on tourism. Is the UAE aware of that or conscious of that, or you don't think that's really?
I think they're more aware of it, and the fact that we saw Gargash, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, he made a statement of saying that we all made mistakes in Sudan. So it was almost an admission of a very rare admission by the Emiratis of saying maybe we've been wrong, which we rarely heard before. Yes. But it doesn't mean they have reversed their policy, but it seems that at least a little bit of an admission. I think they're aware of the reputational costs. They might be happy, they might be willing to sustain the pressure and the resistance they're facing in Europe, because they see Europe as equals or even inferiors. If that criticism, that pressure came from the US, I think they would change. Right. I think that's something they can't sustain. I don't think there has been any pressure on investments in the UAE, and no pressure on tourism in the UAE. Most people are very apolitical anyway.
Yeah.
And it's they feel. I think I see a lot of similarities with the Israeli position as well, right? The Israelis have learned to sustain ongoing pressure and resistance, and despite the fact that the evidence shows the Israelis are committing atrocities, they're saying no, it's not happening, and it's still. I mean, Israel is in the end still a pariah state, but in most people's eyes. But there's still enough people saying, okay, yeah, there might be a pariah state, but we're happy to support them. So the Emiratis are thinking. I think they're overestimating how much leverage they have. I think Israel is in a different sort of ship, considering that they've been doing this for 40 years. They've built their networks for 40 years. The Emiratis have only really been doing it for not even 20 years. But I think they're just saying, we can sustain this for an indefinite period. Yeah.
We spoke about this briefly on the last show, the relationship between the UAE and Israel. How has that relationship fared over the last couple of years of genocide? What is, how do you assess that relationship as it currently stands?
I mean, there's not much left of that relationship, to be honest. And that, I mean, so the Abraham Accords, what's the number one reason the Emiratis engaged in the Abraham Accords is they wanted an out-of-jail card in the United States.
Right.
And they're using the Abraham Accords. And it's been extremely successful in that. It was never about Palestine. It wasn't even about Israel. It wasn't like the Emiratis are saying, oh, we love the Israelis. It was really just a way of getting influence in the West in pro-Israel networks. And in that respect, I think it has delivered. It continues to deliver. And hence, they will never jeopardize this or put it into question. Although they have used it publicly, at least, of saying if, annexation of the West Bank, the formal annexation, we should say, because the informal one is taking place at the moment, but the formal one would be a red line that we will not tolerate. So that was and that came towards the end of, well, I don't know if we're at the end of the war yet, but at least just before we had this breakthrough in Gaza diplomatically, they've been saying we put this on the line. They're under immense pressure domestically. I think especially people in the Northern Emirates and also in Dubai are, very public, very vocal about what the Israelis have been doing. They've never used this to question their own government or question the Abraham Accords because that would be not allowed in terms of civil societal discourse. But they've been calling out the Israelis. So Abu Dhabi had to respond to that. They had to, open the valve a little bit to release some of that public pressure. And they're quite happy now that there's less and less public focus on Gaza. And I think that's true. But that relationship continues. But what we've seen since the 7th of October is that the Emiratis have stopped putting more money into Israel. So the investments have stopped. Although some investments, obviously very sizable ones, remain in the country. They haven't gone up full 180 and they wouldn't. But they basically froze the relationship where it was.
And why is that? I mean, what's the because of course, when we look at again, these are all anecdotes, but videos of people wearing, Palestine shirts at the airport are told to cover up, or someone wearing a kufiya are told, either arrested or told to not show such an obvious sign of Palestinian support. There is an overt anti-Palestine sentiment that's coming, at least from the authorities. So explain, that with the freezing of
I don't know if it's anti-Palestine. It's quite what is clear from a lot of leaked sort of U.S. diplomatic cables.
Yes,
MBZ has always talked about the Palestinian issue in a derogative way. He's not a big fan.
Right.
But overall, the Emiratis do side generally with the Palestinians, not with the Israelis.
Yeah.
Apart from some influencers who are paid to become Zionists. I mean, there are 2 or 3 sort of accounts that have gone to Israel and becoming suddenly promoters of Israel. But except for, outside of that, the Emiratis are not pro-Israel.
Right.
They generally side with the Palestinians. And therein lies the problem. Because the Emiratis are so scared of political mobilization domestically that someone who comes into their country with a badge of pro-Palestine or a kufiya or flag is potentially rallying support around a cause that the government doesn't control. And that is a cause that could potentially run against government policy when it comes to the Abraham Accords. I think it's this obsession about the Palestinian cause being a mobilizing tool that could be used against the regime, which I don't think it would, but they see it as a potential threat against the regime, means that it has to be, they have to clamp down on it wherever it starts.
And why is the UAE so obsessed about civil society organizations across the West? There is now a very heavy call in the United States to ban the Muslim Brotherhood and, and to ban organizations like ICNA and CARE. And, these are very Islamic organizations that work within the community and do charity work. There was a poll, I think, that was recently published in France, which seemed to indicate that a large section of Muslim civil society were Muslim Brotherhood supporters, and the poll was supported by and paid for by the UAE, and and in Britain, of course, you've got heavy lobbying in terms of the British political establishment against some organisations here who they connect and they claim are too heavily connected to the Brotherhood, and of course this is just a claim to try to sort of curry favor in these capitals. Like, what's going on there? What is it about Western Muslims that really irks, I suppose?
It's not just Western Muslims.
Yeah.
So if you're scared of civil society in general, then
Right.
any civil society is a potential threat to your regime.
Yeah.
Any civil society that goes into the societal and political space. The Emiratis are quite happy with, having people chat and talk about sports or entertainment and sort of things that are outside the political realm. They're not a threat to the regime. You talk about societal issues or political issues, whether you use Islam for that or not, doesn't really matter for them. But that's a space that the state has to control, that Abu Dhabi has to control. The mosque is a mobilizing tool that nobody can control.
Yeah.
And hence the mosque has always been, for the Emiratis, since 2010-11 at least, a major threat, because that's where the Arab Spring started, that's where the protests started. So you have to clamp down on this.
Right.
The Muslim Brotherhood has become a sort of catch-all phrase to basically tarnish the reputation of any single Muslim civil societal group, from charities to whatever education, to say, okay, these guys, Muslim Brotherhood equals terrorism. It's a broad brush. I think in 2014 they were fairly successful with injecting that discourse into the CVE debate in this country,
Right.
in the civil countering violent extremism one. But I think it has run its course. Most people don't respond to it anymore. Also because the Israelis have been using the Muslim Brotherhood trope against Muslim civil society. They see Muslim civil society equally as a threat. So they have been using it, abusing it, especially when they said, you're Hamas and this person is Hamas, we're all Hamas, they're all Hamas. The Emiratis are a little bit like this as well. It becomes almost, it's a joke now, where everyone is now suddenly a Muslim brother. I mean, there's been this scandal in 2023 where the Emiratis allegedly paid a firm somewhere in Switzerland and whatnot to tarnish the reputation of journalists and academics and civil society leaders as being Muslim brothers. And many of them weren't even Muslim, and had a lifestyle that was certainly not in keeping with the more, socially conservative part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's irrelevant now. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that existed in Egypt as the Muslim Brotherhood. And when you ask them about it, because I would make the claim that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has been degraded. It no longer exists. It's not a threat to the regime anymore. Networks exist of people who might be intellectually affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They might exist anywhere. But does that make them Muslim brothers? And why is that even a problem? The narrative that the Emiratis have is they use this one element of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is they completely ignore Hassan al-Banna and these sort of dawah-based part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and go directly into the takfiri sort of approach that Qutb advocated for. So, and they're basically saying Qutb is a terrorist. All of the jihadists go back to Qutb. So Qutb was a Muslim brother. So basically the Muslim Brotherhood is linked to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's a quite of an intellectual split that they're making there, which is a kind of vague, has been debunked by academics and by theorists and by Islamic scholars. And so they're preaching that to their own echo chamber. The Israeli networks are quite happy to pick it up because it serves their narrative as well, but it doesn't really have a lot of traction.
In our last conversation, we spoke it was very briefly about the way in which the Abu Dhabi weaponizes religion. It's not just an anti-religion. There is a weaponization of, in particular, Sufism. And a lot of the people in the comments said, well, where's the proof of that? Where's the evidence of that? And I don't know if you've got, you may not want to comment on individuals, but Abdullah bin Bayya is someone that at least I've come across who runs, or at least is very much spearheading this sort of idea that Abu Dhabi and that the UAE is a bastion of tolerance and peace across the world. Can you speak to that? Like, what is how useful are these actors in whitewashing, I suppose, the UAE's atrocities abroad?
No, so if you look at the Fatwa Council in the UAE and those people who are there, they usually propagate a quietist Islam.
Yeah,
quietist in the way as that they're saying, let the ruler get on with politics and societal affairs. We're there. We talk only about religious affairs and theology, which is separate from the state. There's clear separation. The idea of the Wali al-Amr, I think we discussed last time.
Yeah.
This is a powerful tool because you can basically tell people stay out of politics, because you can be a very good Muslim and not talk about politics and societal issues.
Yeah.
And we give you this is the kind of religious, theological legitimacy to do so. And it's a tool to demobilize civil society and also legitimize the suppression of civil society. And by the way, not just Muslim civil society, any sort of civil society. And it's a very powerful tool. And, I don't think Sufis per se, obviously, they don't want to be instrumentalized in that way. But Sufism has been instrumentalized by the Emiratis to kind of create that narrative of pushing back. And then what is more, I don't know if we talked about it last time, but what is more problematic is the Madkhali madhab. So the Madkhalis, come out, it's not even a madhab, it's a sort of very small school of originally coming from Saudi Arabia. And they're very, very radical, quietist Sufis, where they're saying, we have to blindly follow the lord of the land, whoever that might be, whether it's the regime in Saudi or in the UAE or Khalifa Haftar in Libya or whatnot. And blindly following, you're creating basically a dedicated group of Muslims who follow the leader blindly into battle, even when the Muslim leader is committing atrocities and goes against, any sort of Islamic value. And they're fundamentalists in that way. And why they become so, they've appeared in Libya in particular, in the post-revolutionary environment in eastern Libya. They've become, some of them, the Praetorian Guard, if you will, of Khalifa Haftar. And they've basically said, okay, you're Islamist, you're Muslim, you're looking for Muslim mobilization to make sense of the political or socio-political atrocities around you. We'll give you a great sort of narrative for that. And this is your narrative. You can mobilize as Muslims, but you're doing this blindly following the lord of the land, which in your case is Khalifa Haftar. And so it's become a tool to legitimize and enable repression and enable these sort of political military strongmen.
One final question for you, Andreas Krieg. I mean, do you feel that you speak very openly against the Emiratis and what they do in these places? The last conversation we had, you talked about the axis of secessionists and just this network that they've created across the world. I mean, have you had any pushback from the Emiratis? Like, do you feel is there heat on you for raising
no,
those issues?
Obviously, I'm quite happy to be challenged on any of that, especially on social media and so on. You get commentary. People. Mostly these are the kind of pro-regime bots and trolls that don't really have any analytical ammunition to really counter any of that. What is fascinating? It's not about tarnishing the Emiratis. I mean, like I said, I have quite a lot of admiration for how they did it. It's quite fascinating as a case study. And as a scholar who looks at international relations and statecraft and strategy, it's an immensely powerful and interesting case study. The question is, and what I do understand here as well is why the Emiratis are doing it, and it serves their national interest. I think any government should be advancing their national interest. But what I don't understand is that the Emiratis are doing it even when there is a resistance, that they don't have the sort of flexibility, the pragmatism to adjust their course when they see they've gone wrong, and admitting that they've gone wrong. Like I said, you could make the claim the Qataris have had that sort of epiphany as well during the Arab Spring. They were supporting a variety of different non-state actors. They realized it didn't go anywhere. They backed down. They even had changed their government and had a new emir coming in, clean sheet, changing their statecraft, learning their lesson and moving on. The Saudis, like I said, also learned their lesson in Yemen, realizing it didn't go anywhere. MBS learned some of the lessons of what happened, of the Khashoggi killing and murder and the fallout of that, and again adjusted course. With the Emiratis, they've never done it. They've never adjusted their course because they think they can sustain it. And what I don't understand is, here's a country that has developed immense power and influence in the world. Why are they not using it for something good? Why are they not using their indispensable role in Libya, in Yemen, in Sudan, in Somalia, to actually work for a constructive for a solution constructively that works for everyone, for locals, most importantly, obviously, but also get the backing of the international community, and not always push back when you're being called out. And obviously, the attack thing, especially when people are being attacked, you're Muslim Brotherhood because you say this, or you're financed by this country or that country because you're criticizing us. Instead of having the maturity of engaging in a discourse, because I think there's quite a lot to learn, and the Emiratis can be proud of their leadership in some respect in terms of what they have achieved and how they generate power and influence. But they need to also be made aware of where they've gone wrong. And the problem is a lot of the scholarship is too scared, because the Emiratis are extremely coercive in that way, right? They use any form of, putting pressure on you, on the institution, on, in the public domain as well. Where, I think once you get to a point where that pressure is mounting, a lot of people are backing down and saying, what's in it for me? I've been looking at the UAE now for the last, over a decade. And, it's a fascinating case study, and I will continue looking into it. But unfortunately, a lot of that scholarship who looks at the UAE has moved away from it because they're too scared to say something wrong. So they're looking at the fuzzy, bits of what the UAE are doing without actually looking at their intellectual, philosophical thinking, but not looking at how they do it. And that's, I think, the aspect that most people shy away from, because in the formal domain, the UAE, as I said, use their formal organizations, usually for good ends most of the time. But it's the informal networks under the table that are now coming ever more to the surface that need to be studied as well.
Dr. Andreas Krieg, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.